Hello, this is a video recording for paper 2 of the AQA A-level sociology paper, and it's called Topics in Sociology. So let's get on with looking at what the paper entails. It's a 2-hour exam. It's worth 80 marks, and those 80 marks are divided into 2 sections. It's going to be a booklet with other topic areas in, so make sure that you turn to the topic you have studied. So for my students in particular, we've looked at in year 1 families and households, and then this year we looked at beliefs in society. They're both equal weighting, so 40 marks each, so spend the same amount of time, divide your time up equally. So 1 hour for the families and households and 1 hour for the beliefs in society. It's really important that you have a look and familiarise yourself with the format of the paper. So go and have a look to see if you can get any past papers. I know it's a new spec, but there are some specimen papers that your teacher should be able to give you. So have a look. As you can see, it's a nice paper because it's very standardised. So you're going to have 2 10 markers followed by a 20 marker for both families and households and for the beliefs in society. Looking closer at the question types, it's really important, and examiners' reports have reported this year after year. It's really important to divide your time. It's time management that's going to be the key to success in this exam. So you know that you've got 2 10 markers and a 20 marker. And the rule is 1.5 minutes per mark. So you're looking at spending no longer than 15 minutes for a 10 marker and 30 minutes for a 20 marker. Now, if you look at the 10 markers, you can see that they're asking you to explain 2 things. So divide that 15 minutes up into 7.5 minutes per explanation point. That way you give yourself the maximum amount of time that you possibly can to spend on explaining and developing those points. The next thing that's really worth looking at, and you'll see on this PowerPoint, the AO breakdown. That's the assessment objective breakdown. Do you even know what AO1, AO2 and AO3 stand for? It's really important that you do, so you can showcase and display to that examiner the skills that you know and have refined over the past 2 years. So let's look at AOs in a little bit more detail. So what is AO1? AO1 is knowledge and understanding. What does that mean? It means that you need to make sure that you go into that exam knowing your theories. You've got a good sound knowledge of the range of theories: functionalism, Marxism, feminism, postmodernism, and making sure that you've learnt the concepts that have come out of those theories and the studies associated with those theories. How well can you provide evidence? How well can you explain? How have these theories arrived at these ideas? What methods have they used? AO2 is about applying your theory, and so it's really about making sure you're explicit when you bring in a theory, why you're bringing it in. Why is it relevant to bring in functionalism or Marxism into that particular question? Making sure you can link ideas, linking concepts, linking theories as well. Can you look at the similarities between approaches and concepts? Do they build upon one another? Making sure that you constantly link back to the item or the question for the essays, making sure that you've linked back and everything that you are applying is answering that question, that you're not waffling on and doing some storytelling, massive descriptions of things if it's not relevant. So no long stories, explain its relevance. With the item, making sure that you have applied those hooks, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit later, but looking at the hooks and explaining and applying your knowledge to those hooks and linking other areas of the course. When you answer a question, think to yourself, are there any other topic areas that is relevant to apply here? So for instance, if you have a question on divorce, you know, religion and beliefs and talking about secularization might be applicable, but obviously only apply it if it's relevant. AO3 then is analysis first, so it's about those students who can give me detail, rich detail, deep understanding, not skimming over points. So we're going to talk about your chain of reasoning, which will help you here a bit later on. So making sure you have developed an argument in detail. I kind of like to think of it as toothpaste. When you squeeze all of the toothpaste out, that every last bit of that toothpaste out of the tube, making sure you've covered everything that you possibly can that's relevant to the question. Making sure you can identify similarities and differences, developments, has anybody adapted, has anybody been influenced by a theory? So really showcasing this, I would expect to see sentence stems like, both theories argue, this is in contrast to earlier or later theories, this means that. It's the how and it's the why. And the last AO3 skill that's on show is your evaluation. It's about making judgments, balanced arguments, and not neglecting strengths as well as weaknesses. Lots of people are quick to criticise, but what about the strengths? Can you provide evidence of that strength? What are the alternative opinions? What are the range of arguments you can bring in? It's the howevers, it's the alternatively, etc. Okay, and students wonder how they can revise this. Well, I've got some examples. So for AO1, maybe spending time on learning those theories through mind maps and revision, flashcards, that sort of thing. With AO2, concept cards for each topic area, so you can look at the links between topic areas. Where are the key concepts that are coming out from these theories? Where do they reappear in other topic areas? Also with the AO2 is things like looking on Twitter and the media, the news, for contemporary examples to build into your example for your answers. AO3, essay planning. Can you predict some typical questions? Can you look increasingly at questions that could link other topic areas? Can you already start to think of strengths and weaknesses? Do those tables of comparisons, maybe do different diagrams like Venn diagrams to look at similarities and differences between different. So really quickly, I just want to quickly go through what you're actually supposed to learn and revise, should I say. So if we look at the family and households, the first bullet point is the relationship of the family to the social structure and social change, with particular reference to the economy and state policies. So making sure that you know the theory, what is the role of the family, but also acknowledging that there are comparisons to be made with policies. So have any policies impacted the family, the role and the roles within the family? Looking at theory in relation to policies as well. So thinking about, what do new rights say about policies? Would they argue that policy making is a good thing for the family? And what would they try to encourage? Would it be the nuclear family that they're trying to encourage, or an alternative? Marxists, feminists, what would they say about the current state policies out there in shaping the nature of the family? Be aware of timeframes on this kind of question. So does it say in the last 30 years or does it say in the last 10 years? So if it's in the last 10 years, talking about the Divorce Reform Act and its impact on the role of the family or roles within the family is not going to be relevant. Changing patterns of marriage, cohabitation, divorce, childbearing and life course, including the sociology of personal life and the diversity of contemporary family and household structures. Now, there's lots here, lots to learn. Don't worry too much about statistics and learning them off by heart. Of course, you need to know patterns. You need to be clear on the trends, and not in a simplistic way. A lot of people say, divorce or marriage rates and talk about them in a very sort of straightforward way. They're either going up, they're going down. But look about trends and whether or not they have stabilised in the past. So divorce has stabilised in the past, hasn't just increased since the 70s. Again, look at other topic areas. So where are they going to bring in those questions where they link two areas together? Well, you could have lots of comparisons between family types. So how has trends in marriage or divorce impacted the family structures out there? Has increase in divorce led to increase of single parent families? What has that impacted the experience of childhood, for instance? If people are marrying later, is this going to decrease family sizes? So lots of comparisons there. And again, policy can affect marriage rates. Policy can affect divorce rates. Make sure you can apply theory here. So from topic 1, so making sure that you can say what the new right feel about marriage, cohabitation, separation, divorce, childbearing, and what do feminists say? Making sure you know all of those major theories. Don't neglect the newer theories, things like personal life that look at the expansion of choice that we have as individuals, and be able to evaluate those. Looking at gender roles, domestic labour, this is the area that most students like, and it doesn't cause too many problems. However, there are a few things that I would suggest that you do take note of. First of all, cage it. So if there is a question about are roles becoming equal, be sure to note what roles they're talking about. Are they looking at domestic labour, so in the house, or are they looking at power relationships, so who makes the decisions, and who's in control of money and things like that. So be sure on the roles that they're asking, and make sure that you answer the question for every part they ask about. So if it says things like evaluate the idea that domestic division of labour and power has become equal, then that's 2 things you need to talk about. But cage it, make sure that you say, right, okay, feminists would say this, and the March of Progress would say this. However, is this the case for everybody? So if you add in class, maybe middle class families have become much more equal, whereas working class families, with the constraint of structural problems like poverty, they don't have that ability to be much more symmetrical. What about gender and ethnicity, ethnic differences? Are there differences in roles within the family there? So lots to talk about, and lots of links here to other topic and debates. So have policies impacted the amount of choice we have? Maybe we want to have a symmetrical family, but we are limited. So you could bring in the idea of a personal life and whether or not the choice is actually there, or are the pressures of paying bills and things like that, meaning that the man, the new man, for instance, can't necessarily help out as much in the house as we would have hoped because he's on shift work, for instance. And the next topic area is childhood. Be aware of time. So again, any time frames in the questions. Is it recent childhood changes? Don't talk about the 19th century then. So make sure that there are lots of contemporary examples out there of whether or not childhood is disappearing, policy changes that have impacted the experience of childhood, for instance. Comparing and contrasting is usually the way they use questions here. So making sure you know the social construction of childhood, making sure that you can use different case studies to explain those differences between time and place, but don't storytell. Clear relevance of why you're bringing in a case study would be really good. Making sure you know the theories on childhood, so making sure you're aware of the new rights ideas, March of Progress ideas, Marxist, feminist ideas on the status and the position of children in our society. Family diversity, has that impacted people's experiences of childhood? Demography, so this is a big chunk of the spec, and you do need to know the trends, of course, in births, deaths, family size, life expectancy, migration as well. So what's going on now, but what has gone on in the past? What's its impact? So, okay, if we have changes in migration, is that going to affect the dependency ratio? With the ageing population, don't neglect the positives. A lot of the time students focus on the negatives, but what about the positives, like the grey pound and the fact that, yes, we have an ageing population, but they're also spending money, so bringing money into the economy. Look at your sociological explanations, but also don't neglect other non-social kind of explanations for changes in things like birth rates and death rates and family sizes and life expectancy. So things like technology, things like the economics of a country. And finally, don't neglect globalisation. It's a key theme in this A-level. And so what is the impact that globalisation has on current as well as future patterns? A quick look at the beliefs in society spec. So for ideology, science and religion, make sure that you know the difference, you can define them, but also make sure that you know that a question could come up on just ideology and looking at the characteristics for those 10 markers, or combine both. So what's the difference between science and ideology, religion and ideology? So knowing the social construction argument would be really, really important. Know the similarities and differences between science and religion and any recent changes in ideology, science and religion, any recent contemporary sort of studies that will help you with any major sort of essays with this. It's really important to not just focus on Christianity when you're explaining religion. There are other types of religions out there, so make sure that you can define other types of religion for examples. The relationship between social change and stability, religious beliefs and practices. So make sure that you know what the theories say about religion and what does religion do for society as well as individuals as well as groups, and examine the impact, and also how change has impacted on religion. So a lot of the time students revise this and say, does religion cause change? But very few look at whether or not society and the changes that have occurred in society have had an impact on religion. So if we've globalized, if changes in the internet and media, an increase in oppositional groups, how's that impacting religion? So 2 ways to look at that. So it's not straightforward. Make sure that when you're talking and debating whether or not religion causes change or it doesn't, that you talk about the fact that it might not be as simple and straightforward as yes it does or no it doesn't. What about exploring that it has a dual character? And that could be good for your conclusions. So looking at internal criticisms. Religious organisations, including cults and sects and denomination churches, etc. Really important that you know the characteristics, because again, for a 10 marker, outline and explain, it could be the differences between cults and sects or the similarities between different organisations. So really important. It's also a really good topic area to use for evaluation for that topic 1. So when you're looking at on topic 2, when you're looking at whether religion causes change or whether religion brings people together, are those theories like functionalism or feminism only concentrating on those traditional religions? And are they outdated then? Because actually new religious movements have a different impact on groups or society or individuals. Looking at contemporary changes like globalization and how that's impacted people's recruitment into sects. Looking at things like secularization and thinking to yourself, does that impact the level of people being attracted to these new religious and new age movements? So whilst we have a secularization of traditional mainstream religion, are people changing into these new religious movements? So is religion changing rather than disappearing? Obviously, you need to cage everything, so you need to know the relationship between who joins what and why. So lots of times people look at just cage, class, age, gender and ethnicity. I'm going to add a D to that, caged, because look at disability as well, because it's another group, another social group that could join certain organisations for, you know, specific reasons. When you look at class, don't just look at the poor and the rich. So do working class, are working class less religious than middle class? Yes, you need to know the class differences. What about thinking about contemporary debates like migrant versus the host? So are migrants more likely to be religious than the host individuals? Has globalization impacted the recruitment into certain religious groups? So has globalization pushed more recruitment into new religious movements? And finally, let's have a look at the significance of religion and religiosity in contemporary world. So making sure that you look at secularization, it's very unlikely to be nice and straightforward, is secularization occurring or not? They usually join it with another topic area. So it might be that you have a question about is globalization impacting on secularization? So you've really got to say to yourself, is secularization occurring globally, or is it in certain countries? So things like existential security theory, looking at those less economically developed countries and how they have higher levels of religiosity than more developed countries. And why is that? What's the impact of science in the secularization debate? What's the impact on new religious movements in the secularization debate? Okay, so that's all the spec. Let's have a look at the question types then. So let's have a look at outline and explain. This question will always link two different elements of the topic or specification. So you are being tested on your ability to apply your sociology here. So let's have a quick look at this family question. Outline and explain 2 reasons why the position of children in the UK may be changing. So can you see the 2 elements you've got to link and apply is obviously childhood and the position of childhood. So think about what you've learnt about childhood, the perspectives, march of progress versus conflict theory. And you've got to apply it to it changing. So what has caused children's position, their status, and their position in the family to change? So what have you learned about changes that have happened? So within the topic area of childhood, you've looked at age and status differences caused by perhaps the media, like Postman's ideas. Maybe you could bring in policy and say how the position of children has changed and the status of children have changed because of policy and legislation changes. What about education and how that's impacted the fact that children are more visible in the family because they're much more dependent financially? So really, with the outline and explain 2, it's going to have 2 elements. You've got to think, okay, there's 2 elements there. How am I going to score the 8 to 10s? The 8 to 10 being the top band. And advice here. The structure of your outline and explain, you don't need to waste time on an introduction. Decide before you begin the 2 points that you are going to pick. Make them very different. Don't overlap. Your starting sentence should be one reason is, and then I suggest with my students that they follow the P structure. So think of your point, think of your reason, explain it and back it up with examples. And it's the explanation and the examples where you are going to have to be really good at your chain of reasoning. You need to be detailed. Don't need to evaluate, but I would always stick in an extra however, just because sometimes by looking at however, you're exploring the significance and might hit some analysis marks. The chain of reasoning, therefore, needs to talk theory. So can I relate childhood and the change in position to a theory or a theorist? Any concepts, so Postman and his ideas on what's it called? His media, he's talking about media and his ideas on the fact that it's more accessible for kids to see adult themes in the media because of the fact that we don't necessarily rely on newspapers. We've got much more accessible sort of iPads and things where adult themes that previously were kept from children are now much more accessible to kids. So the theory is there, the concepts will come in, and you've got the key study there. You could always contrast this with an alternative opinion, so making sure that you pick for your second point something completely different. So looking at policy would be good because it's nothing like what Postman's talking about, and looking at the status of children and how it's changed, and there you'll get some concepts associated with policy decision making and legislation. So really try to be clear to the examiner, this is what I'm doing. This is significant because an example of this is, this leads to, sociologists such as argue. This is supported by. Okay, the second question is the item question. Again, it's worth 10, and you'll see with the suggested structure, I've added in Peel, and the E is going to be different to the outline and have a look. Again, no introduction, 7.5 minutes per point, and read the question first and find what two elements in that question are being linked. Okay. Then read the item. So I always say to my kids, look at the question first and say to yourself, what do I expect to be in this item? What am I assuming they're gonna hide, maybe a hidden hook, or what's going to be quite obvious in the item? Then go and search for it. Okay, sorry about that. Read the question and find the two elements that the question is linking, and then go and search the item for those hooks. There usually are about 2 or 3 hooks. They might be obvious and clear, but they might be hidden or semi-hidden. Begin your first paragraph with item states. Okay, so make sure you showcase to that examiner, I've used the item and I've picked something, I've picked that hook and I'm about to develop and explain it. You've got to make sure you do it twice. Don't forget after you've done the first one, because that's what a lot of students do. They use the item once and forget to use it twice. If you don't use the item, you don't reference it, and no material is related to the item, you are at best going to get 3. And again, it's all about your chain of reasoning. How do I hit the 8s to 10s? Well, you need to develop your chain of reasoning. You need to develop back to that hook, unpack that hook. And I've got some advice for doing that, so I'll show you that on the next slide. And this is the difference. With the item, you do need to evaluate. So looking at strengths as well as weaknesses, and don't neglect the evaluation. Make sure that you spend time developing that evaluation. So looking at strengths as weaknesses. So here is my handy tip for a 10 marker. Make sure you use the item. Can you bring in theory to explain the hook? Can you bring in concepts and studies to help explain and develop that chain of reasoning? And can you remember to evaluate strengths as well as weaknesses? Okay, so we'll move on to the next question. I'm back here. Sorry, I need to go back one. Okay, so this is the question, an example of an item question. Again, I've highlighted in the question where the two elements are being connected. So you're looking at arguments, so sociological arguments in support of the idea that religion is a conservative force. So you're looking at 2 things here. You're looking to support, it's the strengths, it's the idea that it is occurring, it is impacting, and it's that religion is a conservative force, so it keeps things the same. Something is kept and preserved. So automatically, I'm thinking feminism, I'm thinking functionalism, I'm thinking Marxism. So before I even read the item, I'm trying to think, how are they going to link this? What's going to be in the item that is hidden, maybe semi-hidden, or it would be lovely if it's obvious. So first of all, you can see the yellow is the hook that I think is hooking to, relating to feminism. The pink binds them together, curbing selfishness, enabling them to cooperate to achieve shared goals, reminds me of functionalism, and privileged groups, allied to privileged groups, upholding their interests, again, Marxism. So you've got 2 very different arguments at the bottom, which I probably would use. I would always try to pick two different ideas that are very different. So functionalism is a very positive outlook on religion being a conservative force, whereas Marxism takes a very pessimistic view of religion being a conservative force. Again, build in a background about the theory. So say functionalism is a consensus-based theory which argues that religion is a conservative force, whereas Marxism is a conflict theory that also believes religion is a conservative force. Look at the similarities and differences. They are both structural theories. They both believe religion preserves the status quo. They preserve society and social order, but one's happy about it and one's not very Okay, the last question then, nearly done, is the talker. Again, applying material from the item. You must use the item at least once, and you've got to bring in your knowledge, and it's going to be a debate. It's an evaluation question. So the first thing that I tell my students is to decode the question. Read it at least twice and look for what is being linked. What is the debate? What is being expected of you? Obviously, an essay has to have an introduction, a main, and a conclusion. And for my introductions, I tell my students to do a DAD introduction, and that's where you have to define. So that could be defining a key term, or if there's no key term there, defining and setting out the debate. Those who agree, therefore, and those who disagree. It's also good in your introduction to be clear if any definitions or any debates are problematic to measure. That's a really good sort of way of building in evaluation to start with. So if you have a question on secularization, you could begin by defining secularization, introduce the debate, those who agree and those who disagree, but also return to the fact that secularization is very difficult to measure, and methods to try to prove that secularization is occurring might not be valid. The main then is composed of peel paragraphs, and this is where your chain of reasoning needs to be detailed. So you need to construct a logical argument where you make points, you explain them, you bring in theory, you bring in concepts, you back it up with evidence and studies and contemporary examples, and then you evaluate. Again, strengths and weaknesses, and the evaluation that is best is if it's explicitly related to what you've just said. So avoid general criticisms like functionalism is a positive theory. Well, that's good, but what would be better is if you are more specific about the nature of what you're criticising. So if you talk about functionalism and how religion binds people together and upholds social solidarity, why not say, however, from an alternative opinion like conflict theory, what about the fact that it can be quite divisive and it can cause conflict? So it's much more specific, therefore. You are criticising a point that you have just made. Even better if you can bring in real life examples. So, the wars that have been started as a result of religion and how it can destroy societies is much more better evaluation. And don't neglect the strengths. And an easy way to do it is just simply to say, well, it's highlighted. It's created an awareness of something. And a logical conclusion. The conclusion shouldn't come as a surprise. This is something you're building up to. So a lot of the time in the introductions, we tend to look at how something is difficult to measure or difficult to define, or nobody agrees one way or the other. This should be hinted throughout your essay. If you're going to use postmodernism, for instance, in your introduction and say that we live in a diverse society now, and so it's very doubtful that one thing can explain the cause or the impact of something. Lyotard is someone that I often tell my students to include, who says there's been a death of meta-narrative. So if your essay question is about a big theory, a meta-narrative is a big story, a big theory, is this irrelevant? Maybe we need to have a pick and mix of different theories because they neglect maybe class, they neglect gender, or another cage element. So if that's what you're going to conclude, make sure it's clear in the introduction and also hint at it throughout the exam essay. So the 17 to 20 marks is what you're aiming for. Just look at the mark scheme. It says it has to be sound, so no mistakes, no inaccuracies. Don't make silly mistakes. Conceptually detailed knowledge. So you've learned a new language, use it. It's your sociological language. No informal conversation like writing should occur. It should be very formal. Should be relevant material, sophisticated understanding. Well, you're going to be sophisticated if you use those key concepts and the theory, and apply it accurately with sensitivity to the issues. So keep going back to that question. Use the words that are in the question to explain your answer. Keep it linked. Keep it accurately applied. Don't waffle on and go off on a tangent. The analysis and evaluation will be explicit, which is what I was talking about. Go for something, if you're going to criticise, something explicit. So maybe it's a method that the person used, the sociologist used, that you could specifically criticise and say, well, we can't generalise because they only used a small sample, for instance. So pay attention to how the theories are constructed, what studies are used, and what methods did they use. Evaluation may be developed, for example, through a debate between different perspectives. That's fine, but make sure it's relevant. So if you have a paragraph where you're looking at an alternative opinion, set it up like a debate. So this is what Marxists look at that functionalists don't. Unlike functionalists, Marxists would say this. Keep the comparison going. Don't just have a standalone, Marxists would say this, 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 and this. It has to be related, and conclusions will be drawn. So let's have a look at one. Let's go back to family example. So apply material from item A and your knowledge. Evaluate the view that the division of labour in couples has become more equal. So the two things that you've got to link are the couples, so the division of labour in couples, and the debate whether or not it's become equal or not. Now, this is a question that's quite straightforward, but there are a few things that I would make sure I talk about just to get into the top band. So obviously look at the item. It tells you in the item that you've got to look at feminism, and it hints at that could be one of the evaluation points. So feminists would obviously reject the claim. And above, it's talking about or hinting at the symmetrical family, so Wilmot and Young and the March Progress view. So those are the two key ideas that most students will pick up on. Now, avoid a list. Don't have a list of yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. It's about depth. We looked at that when we looked at AO1 and AO2. It's how detailed your answers are going to be. It's how well you unpack those feminist ideas as well as those March of Progress views. Try to bring in contemporary developments in the debate. Don't just stick to the 70s and the 80s. So bringing in much more contemporary theories, so choice. To what extent is the division of labour in couples a product of choice versus constraints like structural constraints? So people might want to have a symmetrical family, but they can't. Also, students tend to treat people as the same, as a homogeneous group. So all couples are either equal or all couples are not equal. Well, cage it. You know, are there class differences? Are there gender differences? Are there ethnic differences when it comes to looking at those debates? And what other topic areas could be relevant to showcase here? So you might want to bring in the fact that policy has impacted whether or not couples have become more equal. So policy changes might encourage the symmetrical family or discourage it. So a handy tip on evaluating, and this is handy for all of your exams. If you're sat there and you think, right, I now need to evaluate, this is what I tend to tell my students to do. Think, cage, class, age, gender and ethnicity. Is anything neglected in the theory? Is it outdated? Is the debate outdated? Have things changed? Alternatives. Could you bring in conflict or a consensus theory or personal life theory if it's a family question? Are your studies very Eurocentric, so based in a sort of Western societies, or do I need to consider that actually I can't transport that theory to other global locations? So think about whether it's relevant globally or not. And has globalization been a key theme in this A-level? Has that had an impact? And the last thing that I talk about with my kids is methodology. Is it hard to measure? So if we go back to the example of couples and have things become equal, it's a really difficult thing to study, because actually, how can we measure it? Some women may be worried that there's stigma against them if they confess that, yes, they do work more and perhaps equally to the male. And maybe men feel that they don't really want to confess that they do help around because of help around the house because of issues of masculinity. So always consider, right, okay, this is the debate, but can we measure it? Can we easily define it? And what methods have these feminists or have these Marxists or whoever you're talking about, what have they used? Is it quantitative? Is it qualitative? And can I attack that? So doing a little diagram like this when you evaluate or revise is quite handy. Okay, so that concludes the PowerPoint. So I just want to draw this to an end. Just some final tips. Make sure you read the question twice. Each question, make sure you're answering both elements that are being connected. And think to yourself, what topics could be included? This is particularly useful for paper 2. So for beliefs, for instance, don't just go down aisle 1 and 2. If you do a weekly shop, you go down all of the aisles. It's the same for answering a question. Think, can I bring in secularization? Can I bring in globalization? Can I bring in theory? Don't think of these topics as separate. It's about bringing them all together if relevant. And do think about the do's and don'ts. Don't waste time on introductions for 10 markers. Make sure you use the item twice, things like that. And above all, do not panic. You can do this.